Welcome back to another episode of the Braun Performance and Rehab Podcast, powered by ISOFIT, Oro Muscles, and Firefly Recovery. ISOFIT is my go-to for all things isometric strength training. For more on ISOFIT, be sure to check out isofit.com. Oro Muscles revolutionizes rehabilitation with real-time actionable insights into muscle activity with live biofeedback and instant analysis, which has made a huge impact in my work with athletes. For more on Oro, be sure to check out oromuscles.com. Episodes like this are made possible by Firefly, the official recovery provider of the Braun Performance and Rehab Podcast. For more on Firefly, be sure to check out recoveryfirefly.com. Today, I'm joined by Warren Bradley. Warren is the founder of a company called Hytro, which makes wearable BFR. I'm a huge fan of Hytro, and I'm a huge fan of Warren. I had the pleasure of meeting him last summer. We recorded this podcast shortly after we met, and we dived into a lot of different things surrounding BFR, from mechanisms and applications and beyond. This is a really great episode, and I know you're going to love it. Enjoy. Warren, welcome to the podcast. I'm super excited to work with you today, man. Thank you so much for being here.
No, thank you, Dan, for having me, bud. It's good to meet up again after we met a couple of months ago, right, in Pittsburgh.
Yeah, Pittsburgh at Sportsmith there. Shout out to Brad for making the connection between the two of us there. He told me that he freaking loves you and everything that you're doing, Warren. But for people who might not be familiar with you or might not be as up to date on all the incredible stuff that you're doing in this human performance space and Hytro and all that, would you mind filling them in a little bit about what you do?
Yeah, of course. We make BFR accessible, so blood flow restriction training. And the way we make it accessible is through both education and also with products. So what might be useful is just to give a little bit of background on my background in terms of work, and it will segue into the synthesis of Hytro, why that came about. And it'll just color the picture and let people understand why the product exists and what it does, I guess, and the services we provide. So just circling back, I spent just over a decade working in professional sports. So I worked in some pretty high profile teams. So my first team ever was Munster Rugby. I'm not sure if you're aware of rugby teams over in the US so much, but over here, that would be one of the biggest Premiership rugby teams, so huge. So I cut my teeth there the first couple of years of my career. And I started my PhD at the same time. So I was match funded by the club and by the university, Liverpool John Moores University. I then moved on to England Rugby for several seasons. So I was with England Rugby for 5.5 years and did the Seven Circuit. So I was in the Olympics for Rio. I didn't actually, unfortunately, get to go to Rio. They couldn't pay for the additional staff to go, but I was in the Olympic cycle, obviously working on that. And then I transferred into the Premier League, Championship football, and worked at various teams there. But so I had the background in sports science, I guess, in working at the coalface. But I also did my PhD simultaneous in exercise physiology and nutrition. And because of that synergy, I was able to, I guess, work at the coalface, but innovate and critique at the same time, as opposed to reading the research and applying it exactly how it's stated. I was the one reading it saying, what about changing this, and hypothesizing ways to make it better. So I came across a technique called blood flow restriction training for rehabilitation purposes. And we'll come into how it works shortly. But essentially, I did some critiquing. I said, how can we make the devices that exist a lot better and a lot more accessible? And at the time, there were big cuffs, big boxes, loads of wires, digital apps, and things like that. And I was like, well, I can only do one-on-one supervision and practitioner with an athlete. So I said, what if we can make this accessible for everyone? You know, anyone in the world, at home, groups of people at the same time. And again, we'll come to all the detail, but that led to the conception and the synthesis of creating the idea for Hytro. I applied for the patent, and then here we are 6-7 years later.
That's an incredible backstory, Warren. And I mean, it certainly sounds like you've worked in a variety of sports at the highest levels of human performance that way. And you're right. I think that BFR is something that we really need to apply in these populations, because we're talking about minute percentage differences that separate these athletes between winning and losing matches that way. So anything that we can do to really gain that edge, whether it's in a performance setting or rehab setting, we really need to do. I think that BFR is a great tool for that. You know, I'm interested, though. You mentioned that you were doing your PhD and working in these performance settings simultaneously. You didn't mention anything about sleep during that time, Warren. I don't know how you did both at the same time. That is a huge grind, and definitely not something to be taken lightly there on your end. On the BFR side, though, like I mentioned, I think that the application point for it is becoming more known, that, you know, providers coaches realize, hey, we should use this because there's something to it. But I think there's definitely a lack of understanding as far as the actual application and even just the underlying physiology of BFR that way. And even explaining it to patients and athletes the first time, the look on their face is usually kind of priceless. It's like, wait a second, so you're going to put a cuff on me. It's going to reduce my blood flow, but it's going to help me get stronger, or it's going to help me condition better. So, what exactly, from a mechanism standpoint, how does BFR work? What does it do? What kind of things have you kind of seen as far as the overall development and our understanding of BFR over the past several years that way?
Sure. I guess we'll dig into the physiology first, and then we'll start segueing into the wider utilities. So I don't know if anyone's watching the video here, but I'm gesturing to the top of my arm or the top of the leg. So you apply a cuff or a strapping mechanism to the very top of your limb, so the most proximal point, and it applies a really strong circumferential pressure, just meaning the circumference of the limb. And what that's going to do is allow blood to flow into the limb from the body, but it restricts the return flow back from the limb. So imagine turning the tap on in a sink and putting in the plug. You're going to get a pooling of water. That's what happens in the muscles. But when the muscles start to swell with blood, obviously the muscle cells are swelling, so they get stressed. They start to use the oxygen, and then it becomes deoxygenated, so they become hypoxic, low oxygen. So that's again a stress. This is all happening independent of movement. This just happens by applying BFR. And what all of this accumulates to is it increases the sensitivity of your tissues to anything you choose to perform exercise-wise. So we like to think of it as a multiplier. So if you go for a walk with BFR applied, the muscles are so sensitive to that exercise that it's like your sprint training in terms of the adaptations you can get. Or on a bike, on a very slow cycle, it's like your sprint training on a bike. Or as you mentioned before, lifting light weights or body weight is like lifting a heavy weight in the gym because the muscles have become so stressed that anything light becomes very difficult and the muscles are more sensitive to it. Now, we can go a hell of a lot deeper into the science if you wish. I'm not sure if you want that on the podcast, but there's a lot of deeper mechanisms that can explain why that works and why you get stronger. But the simple
Yeah.
fact is it makes the tissues more sensitive.
Yeah, no, I'm definitely down to go a little deeper, but it sounds like thus far we have the cell swelling principle in the sense that we're going to have more of a localized blood accumulation there. And then you
Mhm.
also mentioned, the hypoxic state that way. So being able to function in a state of deoxygenated at the local tissue level, whether that's upper extremity or lower extremity, that way. And you're right about the overall application, and we'll get into that in a little bit, but I certainly think it's a very powerful tool where we can use extremely low loads to get the benefits of lifting heavy. So we'll dive into that in a bit. But on the actual physiology, is there any other principles that you see really being primary drivers outside of cell swelling and hypoxic state of tissue?
Absolutely. So it depends on how you want to use BFR and what your goals are. So traditionally, it's a rehab tool, right? So that's for basically hypertrophy, essentially, or cardiovascular adaptations. When you're in a kind of low impact state or you can't load the tissues, right? But what we've realized in recent years is, well, those mechanisms can apply to things like recovery, or they can apply to things like warming up and preparation of tissues. And the mechanisms for that are slightly different, but similar. There's some kind of the Venn diagram is the middle bit, but there's some slightly different mechanisms. So I'll run you through those very quickly. So let's talk recovery. Like let's recover you after a heavy exercise session or competition, let's say. Same principle, lock in the blood flow restricted device around the upper limb. It's typically the lower limb because it's a bigger limb and you're normally lower body dominant sports. But if you're an upper body dominant sport, it could be the upper body. Neither here nor there. So we're locking in the blood, causing swelling, causing that tissue sensitivity to increase, but then you unstrap or deflate the cuff, let's say. And what that does is a couple of things, two main things really. One is a flush. So all that pressure that's built up in the limb, imagine blowing up a balloon and letting it go. You're going to get a powerful ejection of air. That's what happens in the limbs. It removes inflammatory markers like interleukin 6, creatine kinase, flushes waste materials essentially. So it removes that from source. The body then uptakes them and excretes them. And the last thing that happens, that's one of the most important things I think, is the reperfusion. So fresh blood is driven into the tissues. Now, I want you to imagine your muscles are like a sponge, like a dish sponge, that you clean dishes within a sink. So squeeze that sponge, plunge it into water and let go and see what happens. Well, it absorbs the water very quickly. If you just put it in, and let go. It doesn't really absorb water very effectively. You need to squeeze it. So imagine your muscles under a BFR condition are like a squeezed sponge. You then let go and there's fresh blood being pushed in. It's all driven into the tissues way more effectively. So if you have like glucose in your bloodstream or amino acids in your bloodstream or collagen or whatever, depending on what you've consumed, they're going to be more readily driven into those tissues because the tissues are more sensitive. So it's a very, very good recovery tool. That very same mechanism can just be moved before exercise. So we're just renaming it now. It's the same principle, but that could be a preparation tool because all those things I talked about are really good for preparing tissues and reducing injury risk. So yeah, there's the training, which we discussed with the low load, with the low intensity work, but there's also the recovery. There's also the preparation. And there's one final one, which is becoming more and more popular, which you probably see in your clinic actually, but it's the analgesic effect, so the pain relieving effect of BFR. That's a very interesting one. So we have elderly patients and some non-athletic populations, elderly people, athletic populations too, of course, that have tendinopathies and joint pain, but they're using it on a day-to-day basis, just holistically to maintain or manage pain. And the reason BFR works for pain is because it's an analgesic. It increases your pain threshold, which therefore reduces the perception of pain of anything you choose to do after. Secondary, well, it's also a primary mechanism, but at the same time, because it's pushing more blood into the tissues, it's warming them better and improving elasticity and qualities. So your tendons are way warmer, they're way more elastic, they can move more freely, and there's lower pain. So it's a really good device for pain relief too.
You touched on so many amazing points there, Warren, and just to kind of run it all back here one by one. First off, from a physiological standpoint, I think that there's so much we often forget about as it relates to biomarkers and metabolites and other things that accumulate as a result of exercise and activity. I think it's so easy for us as coaches and clinicians to get so caught up in what we can see and say, well, your muscle's sore because you just did you just did 4 sets of 20 leg extension. So that's why your quads are sore. We kind of forget those underlying things that are happening at the cellular level or at the more localized level. So understanding that using BFR can actually have changes on that underlying physiology, on the levels of metabolites that are accumulated in certain areas is a super essential point, in my opinion. And I love how you brought up it can help on the recovery side, but it can also help on the warm up or preparation side of things, because I think that a lot of times we just kind of resort to the same basic warm up because it's what we've always done, when in reality, it's clearly not doing what we need it to do. When we look at things like injury rates, right? Like injury rates have gone up for years now. So clearly we need to evolve and adapt what we do and how we do it. And it certainly makes sense to me, theoretically, if we improve the underlying physiology or the underlying state of what's moving through the tissue, then we're going to perform at a better level, and hopefully our risk of injury is a little bit lower. You touched on the analgesic effect as well, and it's so interesting because I use the BFR cuffs all the time in the post-op ACL population, and pretty much all of them have some kind of tendon graft, and pretty much all of them have pain in the site of that tendon graft harvest for a few months or sometimes a little bit longer, just related to the fact that surgery essentially induces tendinopathy in this case. But I find using the BFR cuff allows us to train at a pretty good intensity and pretty good stimulus, with minimal to no discomfort for the majority of the time. So I completely echo your point on the analgesic effect is, something that allows us to get reps in when otherwise pain would prevent us from doing so. And I actually have one individual who had a ton of anterior knee pain after a BTB graft, who we BFR'd and tested on a dynamometer, and he actually tested higher force output using the BFR cuff than no BFR cuff, which kind of baffled me at first because, like you mentioned earlier, normally with the BFR cuff, we don't need as high of an intensity to get the kind of adaptation that we want to drive. But in this case, the analgesic effect was so strong that he was able to push 15 to 20% more force through his involved leg, open chain, just because of the amount of pain reduction that he experienced. So it's certainly one of those things where I think there's so many application points, and the sky really becomes the limit to what you can do with it. It's limited by your creativity, I feel.
100%. And therein lies the issue, right? So this is incredible that BFR can do all these things, but try and apply this in a widespread setting. So you should really supervise BFR use because of the safety limitations of like proximal location and the pressures used. So now think about using this with a group of 70 NFL players. How do you do that with the existing technology? It's impossible, right? You can't do it. How do you give it to a client to use at home? Perhaps you could train them in it. Perhaps you could really do a good job training them, but your license is on the line. If they do something wrong at home, you should really probably supervise that. And that's why I created Hytro. So I knew all these things that it could do. BFR was an incredible tool. And what we had to solve for was we had to make it simpler, less complex, but it needed to be safe to use without supervision. That was a critical point. So the things that needed to happen for it to be safe to use without supervision were two things. One, it had to always be in a proximal location, no matter who wore it, how they put it on. If you pull on a pair of Hytro shorts or a tee, the strapping mechanism sits proximal on the limb. You can't mess that up. Therefore, anyone can wear it safely in terms of positioning. Two, the pressure applied by our strapping mechanism has been really carefully constructed. And we went through dozens of iterations of straps so that we could get the right tensile qualities, elastic qualities, and all sorts of lovely things. And what we ended up with is a strap that cannot occlude the artery in 100% of people. So occluding the artery just means closing the artery. Now, I realize some clinicians like to go to full occlusion for certain prescriptions. However, you definitely have to supervise that. If you ensure that you're subocclusive 100% of the time and it's in the right position, we know that it's safe every time for use, unless there's a contraindication. Obviously, that's a completely different kettle of fish. But without contraindications and you're a healthy individual, so long as it's in the right position, it's got a subocclusive pressure, it's safe. And that's what we've created. We've created products that exclusively offer safe and effective BFR. So you can now do it at home on your own. And this is why we're seeing rehab clinics in the UK and US now picking up Hytro BFR as their go-to BFR provider because their clients can use it on their own now. It's not just in clinic. Therefore, better return to play.
Yeah, exactly. Because that's a whole nother piece to this conversation about application, right? Is BFR is powerful, but you have to be able to use it in order to get the benefits from it, right? Like, if you're only able to use BFR once a week, then your window of opportunity, I guess I'll say, is a lot smaller than if you're able to use it 2 or 3 times a week. Or the other piece is what happens when your patients go on the road and travel, right? I had a kid about 5 weeks out from ACL surgery who went on a family cruise for 10 days. So it's like, how do I reach him and still push him to get stronger? Because, 4 or 5 weeks out from ACL surgery is a very, that's a make or break time. If we nail it early, everything else falls right into place and we're good to go. But if we fall behind, we stay behind. So having the ability to kind of provide someone with the wearable tech that I know it's going to be in the right spot. I know the pressure that it's going to be, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe you actually have like a app integration as well. So you can actually monitor different things. And the other piece to the travel side of things is, I think you mentioned yourself on the recovery side, like you can actually recover while you're traveling, which, travel itself has a lot of different physiological effects on the body, from prolonged time not moving to, flights and pressure changes and so on that way. So the fact that you can literally get the benefits of BFR while you're literally anywhere makes it a incredibly powerful tool as well, in my opinion.
I mean, we mentioned this before recording. It's an evolution of BFR, right? It didn't need to get more complex to evolve. What we realized was there's all these ways it can be used, but it's logistically not viable right now because the tools were impractical. They were great and they were effective, but only in certain very specific environments like rehab in a clinic. When you want to travel on a plane or on a bus or coach, or you want to get in a swimming pool, jump in an ice bath, get in a sauna, all these things you can now do BFR within because of Hytro. It is very simple because it looks very simple. It is very simple, but that's only because we spent years and years of R&D research to make it simple. We simplified the complex science and built it so it's just easy for you to use, right? I do need to pull up the app thing. We don't actually have an app, and this is one of the beauties we believe of the products, because we just want unobtrusive, easy to use BFR with no complexity, so no faff, right? All you need to do is pull on our product and strap it to the last setting, to the setting that you've designated to go to, and get cracking. You don't need to log onto an app, look at what you need to do, do all the pressures on there because we built in the pressure. So we know that the top pressure setting on our shorts is around 70% limb occlusion pressure, plus or minus 5%, which means you will be within 65 to 75, therefore safe, therefore effective. So you don't need to worry about that. It's baked in. You just pop them on and go. And therefore, yes, you can use them in a pool or you can use them on a flight. Whereas if you have the app integration, it just adds a layer of complexity. And there's a place for that, of course, absolutely. In rehab, probably. But when we're talking 70 athletes all at once, or when we're talking in a care home where we have elderly people who just want to, stand up, sit down, or go for a walk or Zimmer frame walking, we just need to get them locked in with something simple.
Yeah, no, I think that's such a great point. And sometimes there's a lot more value in the simplicity, actually, I think it's so easy to get lost and caught up in the data side of things, and everyone wants the numbers and the pretty graphs of everything. And not to say that there's not a time and a place for it, but at the end of the day, you don't need that in order to get results. And on top of that, your point on the swim and water application is huge as well. I didn't even think about that, right? But if you add tech to something, anytime you add an electronic component, typically electronics and water don't mix too well. So, if you're working with, a swimmer or a diver or some kind of athlete, triathlete, someone who's going to be in the water for their training, like, you need to have the ability to meet them where they're at. And if they're in the water, but you can't apply BFR in the water, then what are you really doing at the end of the day? You're missing your mark, for lack of a better way to put it.
100%. I mean, we've got teams now, so let's call out a few. Nebraska Huskers, obviously college football, big team. They're using it they've got like a lazy river ice bath. It's unbelievable. But that's their recovery. So it's whatever it is, like 45 degrees Fahrenheit. I'm not sure, something like that. And it's a lazy river. So they'll just get in, strap in the shorts, float around in this freezing cold water with the BFR applied. And hey, presto, you've got a double bang on your recovery. We even had Belgium national football team. So for those into soccer, sorry, like Kevin De Bruyne, one of the biggest soccer stars in the world at Man City, he plays at Belgium. So we got sent this video of him and the whole squad in a swimming pool at the World Cup in Qatar, all recovering in a swimming pool. And we're like, we didn't even know the product could be used in water, but we've realized now it can. And now all these teams are popping up around the world using it in water. And that's the beauty of the simplicity. People are innovating themselves. We often use this term, facilitate the facilitators. So a coach is a facilitator. They're there to facilitate the athlete to get better recovered, better performance, better, advantage and win games. We are facilitating those people because we're giving them a tool to say, right, we've ticked all the safety boxes for you. It's now extremely easy and versatile to use wherever you want. Go away and have a play. And we're getting them coming back saying, oh, we used it in the hypoxic chamber. We used it in the ice bath. We did contrast bathing. And I'm like, that's really fucking cool. I never thought about any of that. And now we're getting all this data back and all this research being done to prove that our product works in these ways. That's not being done with any other BFR product because you can't innovate like that. So we've unlocked this new track of like BFR innovation, essentially.
There's a few different things here. First off, as you mentioned, you can save time by overlapping your recovery stimuli or recovery protocols. You think about how much time athletes dedicate to the recovery space in the first place. And it's like, this is a bulk of their day between sitting in compression boots and then hot tub, cold tub, all these different things. So if you can overlap some of them and get more effectiveness in the same or less amount of time, then that frees up the athlete to do other things, first off. And second off, it might actually restore like a little bit more balance to their life. I think a lot of times we talk about athletes and we get so caught up in the fact that their life is an athlete and we forget about all the other stuff that they do outside of sport. Like, oh yeah, they have a wife, they have kids, they have all these other things. And it's like, if you don't have the ability to access BFR wherever you are, you're not going to be doing it. So this is almost like like I look at it as like a more lifestyle friendly version of BFR than anything else, because you can overlap it with all of these different things. And to your point as well on the research, I'm really interested to see what kind of protocols get developed for some of these overlapping pieces. You mentioned hyperbaric or hypoxic chamber. You mentioned cold. You mentioned heat, and so on that way. And it's going to be really interesting to see what our understanding from a recovery and physiology standpoint is in 5 years when we can overlap so many of these at the same time, right? Like, if we have BFR, we have red light, and we have something else all at the same time, like what does that actually do for us? And is it more powerful than any single one of them individually? Because I certainly think that there's value in overlapping similar principles and similar mechanisms to kind of get more of an exponential effect. And, I think this is another area where sometimes the quote unquote bro science or meathead science or whatever you call it sometimes runs a little bit ahead of the research, because sometimes you get down in the trenches clinically, you start applying stuff and you find people really like a certain combination of things. And if people like it, it works for them and it's safe, then I don't really see much of a reason to not do it.
100%. Yeah, I mean, a lot of recovery from when I used to deliver it in club settings it was driven by science, but it was also driven by subjectivity. If an athlete said to me, I absolutely love doing X, and there was some justification and it was safe, I was like, fine, brilliant. If you really enjoy that and you feel better, definitively, subjectively feel better after doing it and 2 days later, then I'm going to allow you to do that, right? Even if the evidence isn't huge. So that's 50% of it for me, really, is the subjectivity. And yeah, the stacking modality, it's really, really crucial to what we do at Hytro, because we're not sat here saying just do Hytro BFR. What we're saying is this is an adjunct to almost anything you already do to make it better. And therefore, we step out of the fight, the dog fight, which is like, just do your Normatec, just do your ice bath, just do this. You can do this while doing all of those things. So most teams use our product now at the beginning of a regen recovery day, they'll pop on the shorts. They'll then have a suite of options. It's like, here's 8 things that you could do today: stretching, mobility, plyometrics, bike, walk, ice bath, contract, whatever, right? They've got a big menu. They have to pick, I don't know, 3 or 4 of them. It's quite a typical way of doing recovery in clubs. But because you've already got the shorts on, and when it's in the off position, there's no BFR applied, you can choose when to apply it. Your only instruction is you should strap in for 5 minutes times 3 at some point during the session. So athlete A might say, do you know what? I absolutely love doing active BFR on the bike as a recovery. So I'm going to do all 3 lots of my 5 minutes on the bike with the BFR applied. And then I'm not going to apply BFR for the rest of the session, but I'll leave the shorts on because they're already on. Athlete B might say, I like to spread it because I like to stretch with it on, I like to bike with it on, and I like to get in the cold tub with it on. So they'll do 5 minutes of strapping in each. Again, versatile product, so you can do that. Athlete C might say, I hate it on a bike, I'm not doing it on there, but I'll do the bike flush. So they do the bike flush. And they might do most of it in like temperature. So like cold tubs, contrast bathing, because that's the way they prefer to get the blood flowing or restricted. So it gives them autonomy as an athlete. All they need to know is I've got them on, I strap in 3 times for 5 minutes at some point, and it's going to enhance something I'm already doing. I'm just going to make one final point on something that's becoming quite big over here, particularly in the UK, but starting in the US. So they're starting to do like team walks around the pitch as like more of a psychological morale boosting team. Let's just go for a few laps, get the blood flowing. Now, that's not going to do a huge deal for recovery physiologically. It's going to help a bit. It's going to get the limbs moving, the blood flow going. It's not going to do a great deal. If you add in something like Hytro BFR, you'll get a legitimate recovery stimulus from that because you're actually stressing the tissues. So there's teams like Everton and like West Ham and big Premier League football teams who've mandated the use of Hytro while they do that walk. And again, bang for buck, they're already doing the walk. Why not make it a legitimate recovery exercise? They also do it on the bike. So just those few teams, and there's probably others to be fair, but they mandate it because they're already on the bike for a bike flush. Okay, right. Make the most of it. Let's use that 15 minutes and get a greater impact by strapping in at the same time with BFR.
On that point too, you mentioned BFR for recovery and these kind of applications, the bike, the walking, and so on. But I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, but there's also a powerful endurance boosting benefit to BFR in this setting as well, where now, going back to what we talked about earlier about the lower intensity, now I can actually use a lower intensity endurance activity like something on a bike to actually get gains in an athlete's endurance capabilities that way.
Yeah, 100%. So we'll dip into training now. We'll leave recovery for a second. So we touched on the low load resistance work for hypertrophy. Perhaps we'll come back to that. But the endurance side actually is a little bit more interesting for me personally. And the mechanisms here. So let's say we're on a bike, a watt bike, For example, stationary bike, don't go out on the road when doing BFR, please. It's probably not the best thing to do. But on a stationary bike, if we did 15 or 20 minutes of continuous, lowish intensity, it's going to feel high intensity because of the BFR, but lowish wattage, let's say 120, 140 watts on a bike, 15, 20 minutes. What happens is the muscles very quickly become at maximum capacity of swelling. So the muscle cells are swollen. They're going to be very hypoxic very quickly because that oxygen is used for glycolysis, and then the deoxygenated blood can't leave the limb. So what the limb is it's in this state of stress. It's like, bloody hell, I'm stretched. I've got low oxygen. I'm going slowly. So I normally kick in slow twitch fibers, but I've got no oxygen. So I can't create glycolysis. I can't go through glycolysis, can't go through the Krebs cycle. So I have to kick in my type 2 fibers, even though I'm not pushing very hard. So you all of a sudden get this engagement in more muscle fibers. So muscle fiber recruitment's increased. But then they do two more really cool things. One is something called capillarization. So the muscles need oxygen and they're screaming for it. So they adapt and they say, right, well, I'm going to extend my capillary vessels further into the tissues and be more numerous and voluminous in the tissues. Therefore, in the future, I'm going to have more availability of oxygen. That's what the muscles are trying to achieve, right? Get better for that condition in the future. And the second thing it does is mitochondrial biogenesis. So mitochondria, the little factories or powerhouses in the cells, they get oxygen, they get glucose, they smash them together and they create ATP, which is energy. So if there's not much oxygen, they need more mitochondria to make the most of whatever oxygen that there is. So then you take the BFR off this individual and their muscles have become adapted to endurance, basically. They can receive more oxygen because there's more capillaries. There's more mitochondria to create energy from the oxygen, and therefore you have a better endurance muscle or endurance capable muscle. And that's notwithstanding the VO2 max improvements that we see in the research. The mechanisms behind that are a little bit more complex, but in total, yeah, you do BFR 15, 20 minutes on a bike, or even walking, like a fast walk, you're going to get fitter, even though you're doing quite low intensity exercise, which is an incredible.
I completely agree. And it's so interesting to bring up that concept on the mitochondrial biogenesis. I think that's AMPK PGC1 alpha type of pathway that would work through.
Yeah, absolutely.
A lot of times we think that in order to get more of an endurance adaptation, we have to do more. We have to run further. We have to get more intense. We have to dip into higher heart rate zones. We have to just keep pushing and pushing and pushing. And then clinically, I end up seeing a lot of overuse injuries in the endurance athlete population because they've pushed so hard for so long. Like there's been times where I see, female endurance athletes putting in 100, 120 miles a week on just running alone, not mentioning cross training. I mean, that's a lot of volume. And, I'm not an endurance athlete myself. I'm not an endurance coach myself. So I can't really speak to that from my performance side. However, I can't help but wonder if there's more than one way to skin a cat. And I think that's where the use of BFR in that population can really shine is we can still get those gains in performance, but we don't have to push the body into so much of a breakdown type of state where, hey, maybe we can mitigate some of these overuse type injuries that we see so often in the endurance population because we're getting the performance gain, but doing so through a lower load, lower intensity type of stimulus. Like you mentioned before, like even walking can be enough to stimulate these type of adaptations. And on that point as well, there's times when, on the rehab side of things, like I mentioned, I see a ton of post-op ACL. And, if they're 2 months out, they might not be at the point yet where we're jumping and running, but we can walk pretty good. And I want some energy systems development. I don't want to restrict that athlete any more than they've already been restricted, right? How do we shift locus of control back to the athlete and give them stuff that they can do and work on their own? So if they can start that process of hitting those 20-minute or so BFR walks and actually start to improve energy system development that way early on, then we're going to be in a much better spot long term. I think everyone looks for that 9-month mark and what people look like. Well, if that's the cut that we're using, then the earlier I start from energy systems development standpoint, the better they're going to look when we hit that 9-month window.
I mean, at the end of the day, it's a novel stimulus for the body. So no matter who you're using this with, whether it's a rehab patient or whether it's an Olympic standard athlete, we see adaptation pretty rapidly. So there's a really good study with Olympic powerlifters, and was it bench press? I think they've done a couple of different lifts actually, but they essentially found they were plateauing. Clearly, they're the top of their game. And then they had a group who did like 6 to 8 weeks of BFR and a group who didn't. Match pairs, crossover design, I'm sure it was. It was definitely match pairs, if not crossover. And what they found was a several percent improvement in their strength, in their lift for the BFR group. And it was put down to the fact that because it's not tearing muscle fibers necessarily, it's swelling muscle cells to trigger the similar pathway. There's not as much of the damage occurring, but there's still all of the adaptation. And because it's novel, the muscle tissues are like, shit, what's happening? This is very different to anything I'm used to. I'll adapt to this because it's novel. Like if you go for a run, if you haven't for 3 years, it's hard, but you get better quickly. So you can adapt very quickly, no matter where you are on the spectrum, if you're sensitive to BFR, if you're new to it. So from top end athletes all the way through to just someone sedentary who is now rehabbing from an injury, you'd be very sensitive to BFR and create adaptations very, very quickly.
And that's so important. That's so important. And as you mentioned, because there's less of that muscular breakdown occurring, and this ties in with the analgesic effect you brought up earlier, people generally feel good afterwards. Like
Yeah.
people don't feel like, wow, I just got hit by a train, or wow, I just hit legs and now I can't walk for 3 days. Like people generally feel good after BFR. They can tell they did something, but it's not the same kind of like beaten up after exercise kind of feeling that I think people often think about.
No, I totally agree. But one thing I will say is, and I'm going to give you an anecdote in a second, an analogy, sorry, but it is uncomfortable. It's BFR, right? You're obviously creating swelling and additional stress
Oh,
using a.
it's
Yeah.
definitely uncomfortable, but it's not like it's a different kind of uncomfortable. I guess I should have phrased that better.
Yeah, no, 100%. So one of the reasons we use it with these kind of like CrossFit type athletes, or those who like Tour de France cyclists, they're driven to push themselves into the pain cave. They want to be there, right? But they can't always be there because they'll overtrain or they'll create stress injuries. So the BFR is a great way to pull the foot off the gas a little bit because they still feel like they're training bloody hard because their muscles are screaming at them. The lactate buildup is phenomenal and they're stuck in that for several minutes at a time. It's like that last couple of reps on like a 10 RM. Like you feel the lactate build up, but your BFR, you're locked into that for several minutes. So it's pretty uncomfortable. But the great thing is there's no like loading stress. So they feel like they've worked hard and they get the adaptation like they've worked hard, but they don't get the stress or the fatigue or the central nervous system fatigue, which is the incredible thing. Because normally, if you pull an athlete back and give them low loads, they're not really going to buy into it if they're the type of individual who wants to push their body hard. They're like, I need to do more, I need to do more. Whereas when you do this, they're like, oh, okay, I feel like I've done enough. That's great. So it's been a huge win for those types.
Definitely, definitely. No, I completely agree with that. And it's interesting too. We talk about exercise a lot of times and we think about active movement of exercise, especially in the endurance world or typical training world. Have you seen any kind of application with BFR and isometric exercise when we stop moving completely?
Absolutely. And segues very nicely into ISOFIT as well, a fantastic product. Yeah, absolutely. So we do a lot of tendon prep work. Well, I say we, teams that use our product do a lot of tendon prep work with isometrics and BFR. There's a couple of really cool protocols too, which does come away from equipment a little bit, but just doing wall sits with BFR on with our particular product has been super useful pre-competition in changing rooms where you might not necessarily have a piece of equipment. Now you could have ISOFIT, to be fair, you can fit that in the changing room, but you can't fit like a leg extension or leg press, right? So typically people don't have the availability to do isometric work in a changing room. So with our shorts, you can just pop them on, strap in and do some wall sits, 30 seconds on, 120-degree knee angle, 30 seconds on, 30 seconds off times 5. So within 5 minutes, you've prepared that tendon and structure way more effectively than going out doing lunges and anything that's painful. But yeah, isometric work, mate, 100%.
I think historically, when people hear isometrics or think when people hear isometrics, people hear BFR, they always get concerned about like underlying vascular structures. In fact, we just had someone the other week who didn't want to hear anything more about ISOFIT because they were concerned that it would be irritating for a hypertensive population when there's a growing amount of research that shows isometrics actually reduce blood pressure significantly and treat that. So it's one of those things where I think that like you said before, Hytro is the next evolution of BFR. I think that, we have to understand that things are a lot safer now than we think they are, and that we can actually use things like BFR and isometrics together and get a really powerful outcome from it. I think that there's still a little bit of like fear surrounding some of these new things, but I think a lot of them, the barrier to entry is a lot lower than we think. You mentioned it yourself when we referenced the app as well. Like, it doesn't exist. We don't need it. We don't need to get too lost in the sauce or lost in the weeds with what we do. I think that the barrier to entry for these things is a lot lower, and we can just kind of like start using what works as opposed to overthinking everything.
As long as you've done the prerequisite research, I think like that's the point. Like, we're not just coming into this based on existing evidence of BFR. We're doing the
Right.
research, and therefore we're validating and proving our products that they are safe. If we hadn't done that, then we wouldn't be making these claims. Like, I'm a scientist by trade. I've got over 20 publications. It wouldn't be in my bag to make outlandish claims without backing it up with evidence. So I think there is a prerequisite amount of research needed, absolutely, before making these claims. But I think you're right. People are obviously scared. I mean, is that the right word? Or sensitive? Or I don't know what the right word is, but for a good reason, really. They're looking after at-risk patients. So it's good that they're of that mindset, but that's our job to assuage them and prove it to them and show them the way, I guess.
No, I completely agree with that. I think that's a great take and a great point, Warren. As we start to wrap up here, has there been any surprise applications of BFR that you might not have thought about or saw and you were like, wow, that's really cool, or anything that's kind of like gone against the grain, or everything that you've kind of thought about that's worked out really well?
Yeah, there's one in particular actually, which is pretty nuts. So we are collaborating with NASA now. We're going to space in the next couple of weeks. Never thought that would ever happen. Obviously, that was quite left field. But it turns out we've already been accepted onto 2 missions. They're planning on baking the product into the future spacesuits. So the point of this is all about safety and efficacy in space with our current product, with the future intention to build it into spacesuits. So that's pretty left field. That's a pretty unique utility we never thought about. I will say, I knew astronauts atrophied in space and obviously lost bone mineral density and muscle tissue. And I knew there was application for BFR, but I just never in my wildest dreams thought Hytro will be the one to do it. So yeah, that's got to be number one, I'd say.
Do you have any kind of closing thoughts or closing remarks or anything that we might have missed as we were chatting today?
No, I think we've covered a lot of bases there. I mean, if anyone's interested in speaking more, whether it's professional sports setting or rehab or military or anything or space, if you work at NASA, let me know. But get in touch via the website, or even look us up on LinkedIn and Instagram. And we're just at Hytro on Instagram, same on LinkedIn, Hytro, and I'm Warren Hytro.
That's awesome. We'll link to all that in the description below. That way, if people have questions or want to learn more, they can reach out that way. Warren, it's been a real pleasure. I really appreciate your time, man. Thanks for everything.
No, thanks for having me, man. It's been a pleasure. Cheers.